With all the different body systems that we have in our body, it's really important that these systems work hand in hand. And there are two main systems that help to coordinate everything going on in our body. The first body system is the endocrine system. And this system transmits chemical signals, which these are signaling molecules known as hormones, to all locations in the body through our bloodstream. The endocrine system is slow acting, it has long-lasting effects, and the information is received or can be received by cells with specific receptors for that hormone. And it has, again, it's kind of like a key in a lock, it has to fit. The endocrine system is best suited for gradual changes in our body. So things like just us growing, us developing, metabolism, digestion, because it is a slow acting and long-lasting, has long-lasting effects. So it's best suited for that. The other body system that is basically in control and coordinates everything in our body is the nervous system. And in the nervous system, neurons transmit info between specific locations, and it is super, super, super duper fast, like fractions of a second fast. The information that's sent, or the signal that's sent, can be received by neurons, it can be received by muscle cells, endocrine cells, anywhere that these nerve cells or neurons are attached to. This system is best suited for rapid responses quick. So things like reflexes. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see the two being compared. So picture on the right, but letter A, there has to be a stimulus. The endocrine cell releases a hormone. It makes its way into the blood vessel or bloodstream or circulatory system. And then the response, the hormone can be received by targeted cells. Again, it has to fit. There has to be a receptor there. Slow process, because again, right there you can see there's another body system kind of coming into play. For the other picture on the right, we can see a neuron, and the impulse travels down, and you need to be familiar with this word, the axon. So the impulse or signal is sent, again, super duper quick, and in this case, it's received by what looks like an endocrine cell, possibly, whatever it's attached to. And again, this is a very fast process. One reason our body systems have to coordinate so well with each other is so our body maintains homeostasis. And this isn't just for us, but it can be for any living organism. So homeostasis is maintaining a steady, healthy, stable, internal environment, regardless of what's going on around us or the external environment. What ends up happening with homeostasis, our bodies have a set point for certain things. So, for example, we all know normal body temperature is 98.6. That would be our set point. That's what's considered normal. If something is going on, whether we're sick and our immune system is fighting bacteria, viruses, or we're doing exercise, that would be a stimulus, and our body temperature would rise. And then from that, there's a sensor. So our nervous system senses, oh my gosh, the body temperature is going up. And from that, a response is triggered. So in order to keep us healthy, in terms of like if we were exercising, we would sweat. So our integumentary, which is our skin system, starts to sweat. And that in turn cools our body down, which would be the response to that increase. And the response, as I just indicated, returns us back to that set point. So here's a diagram summarizing the last slide. Now, our body doesn't have a perfect set point. for everything, like body temperature being at 98.6. But some things, there's a range, a normal range. Things like glucose levels in our bloodstream. The normal range is about 70 to 110 milligrams. So when we eat, glucose gets into our bloodstream. If our glucose levels are creeping up towards that 110 or exceeding it, that's the stimulus, the food that we eat. If that rises, our body senses it, specifically our pancreas senses it. And the cells in the pancreas, the control center, releases insulin, which is helpful to regulate the glucose and bring those levels down. And from that response, our levels stay within that normal range. To keep our body systems regulated and to keep them at homeostasis, there has to be a certain type of feedback that our body checks in with, essentially. So it knows whether the response should be to get things back in the normal range, or if maybe things should escalate in a sense. So the two types of feedback, checkpoints, are negative feedback versus positive feedback. So negative feedback, the sentence that I always try to remember, more gets you less. This type of feedback is going to get the conditions that are changing back to the set point or back into that safe range. Examples would be, and some of these I already discussed, temperature, getting your body back to that normal temperature of 98.6. Blood glucose levels, getting your levels back down into that 70 to 110 milligram safe zone. Also, something I haven't mentioned yet is blood pH, keeping a safe, almost slightly acidic, but kind of neutral, 7.4 pH. Now, organism example are plants. Plants responding to water limitations. So again, when there's limited water, we have to make sure that transpiration ceases temporarily. So that way the plant doesn't lose too much of its water and then be in a danger zone. So less transpiration. The other type of feedback is positive feedback. And the sentence I remember for this is, the more of a message, more gets you more response. So the response moves the variable further away from the set point or that range. The stimulus amplifies a stronger or more of a response. Examples would be in mammals, lactation. So producing breast milk. This is something that when the breast milk is no longer there, when it's dispersed, the mammal, the baby, needs more to be made. So there's a signal that, hey, the milk ducts are empty, make more. Another example is childbirth in labor. So those contractions of the uterus, so uterine contractions. Again, the baby needs time, the baby needs to come out. So there's signals sent, more contractions, more. And then to give you an overall example of an organism, again, just using plants, ripening of fruit. When it is time for the plant to reproduce and have its seeds dispersed, and we want the fruit to be tasty so critters come over and hopefully eat it. In this case, more ethylene gas being produced. So again, the difference between the two, negative feedback, more of the message that's received, whatever that may be, will get you less. And then positive feedback, more of the message received will get you more. One physiological response to keeping homeostasis is thermoregulation. This is our bodies and any organism's body that is able to maintain an internal temperature within a tolerable range. And there are two main types, endotherms versus ectotherms. Being endothermic is where animals generate heat by metabolism, so metabolic processes. Examples are birds and mammals, so we are included in this group, and we're considered warm-blooded, which is the old term. Ectotherms are animals that gain heat from external sources. So examples would be invertebrates, animals that do not have a backbone, fish, amphibians like frogs, and non-avian reptiles. So two questions to think about. Which of these do you think would be more active at greater temperature variations? And which of these require more energy? So to answer both of these questions, endotherms requiring food for metabolism and maintaining that body heat would require more energy because you have to eat and it has to be produced. Ectotherms are more active at greater temperature variations. So something like a fish, in the winter, they become not as active in the water because the water is very cold. And then when it's summer or spring and it starts to warm up, they become a little bit more active. Now, of these two, I don't think I said, but you could figure it out, ectotherms are what was known as being cold-blooded, but that's not necessarily true. Their blood isn't actually cold, but it just indicates that, again, in cold environments, they're not as active as opposed to being in a warm environment. Here's two examples of an endotherm versus an ectotherm, a walrus endotherm and a lizard ectotherm. Now, one thing to note about endotherms, and this would include us as well, usually ectotherms, they warm up their body by like laying in the sun, laying on a hot rock, hot pavement, in the sand. But endotherms, they do the same thing too. So if we think about like us, like if we're at the beach and we're laying in the sand, we warm up too from our environment. But what makes it different is our body's metabolism keeps us at homeostasis, keeps us within a tolerable range. So both ecto and endotherms can warm up or be colder based on the environment, but it has to do with the metabolism, which would be the endotherms. So same thing as the last slide, showing two different organisms, one being the ectotherm, one being the endotherm. And with this graph, you can see body temperature is on the y-axis, and then on the x is the ambient or the environment temperature. And the river otter, being an endotherm, being considered, again, warm-blooded, is able to maintain a pretty stable or really stable body temperature regardless of the environment. And then again, something like the fish, as the temperature is very cold, the body temperature is pretty cold as well. And then the fish wouldn't be as active. And then the warmer the ambient temperature as it increases, so does the fish body temperature. How organisms use energy, as I already stated, is via metabolism. And metabolic rate is the total amount of energy an animal uses in a unit of time. Comparing endotherms versus ectotherms, as you can imagine, ectotherms have a much lower metabolic rate than endotherms of a comparable size. So comparing two organisms that are similar in size, maybe a horse versus one of those tortoises from the Galapagos Islands. They're pretty big. I don't know that they're horse size necessarily, but two that maybe are really similar in mass. The tortoise would have a much lower metabolic rate because, again, it is utilizing its environment to maintain homeostasis, where an endotherm, like a horse, would need to have a much higher metabolic rate in order to maintain that body homeostasis. Ectotherms are able to balance heat loss and gain by four main physical processes: radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. So radiation is the process where the ectotherm is going to absorb heat from the sun. That's where it's going to get the majority of that heat energy, and it is going to release a little bit of it into the environment around it. Another type is evaporation. So the process of, as we already know this, a liquid turning into a gas. So any liquid that is on the ectotherm is going to evaporate, and that process is going to allow the ectotherm to cool down just a tad. The third type is convection, and convection is where you have heat loss by the movement of air or gases. So the wind, the breeze blowing onto the ectotherm is going to be a heat loss and cool down for the ectotherm. And then finally, conduction is direct contact. So the ectotherm sitting on a hot rock, it's able to absorb heat that way. There are 5 main adaptations for thermoregulation or thermoregulating, and these are things that our bodies can do in response to an increase or a decrease in body temperature. And it can be immediate, it can be over time, seasonal, daily. So a few examples, our bodies having insulation. And when I say our, just please know that it doesn't have to just be for mammals or us, but these are, I always just automatically think people and humans. So insulation, skin being thicker possibly in the winter for certain organisms, in the summer being thinner, feathers, again, more feathers in the winter than in the summer. Fur, same kind of thing, hair being thicker, fur being thicker in the winter than in the summer. And then blubber for different animals, including us with blubber too. Like a lot of people think that, oh my gosh, I'm not as active in the winter, I eat like garbage, I gain a lot of weight. It's a physiological response to our environment. So yeah, we might not be as active. Yeah, we might eat more garbage in the winter where it's nice and cozy and warm inside. But our bodies are designed to accumulate more fat on our bodies to keep us warmer in the winter. So it's something that regardless of the garbage you eat in the not as active as you are, it's just typical that human bodies will gain, even if it's just a tad, a little bit more body fat in the winter. Okay, so moving on to the others, circulatory adaptations, countercurrent exchange, which I'll talk more about that on the next slide, arteries versus veins. Cooling by evaporative heat loss. So again, we sweat when we're hot. That's our body's process of cooling us down. When that water leaves our skin, it has a response of cooling our body down. Behavior responses, so shivering, so we get really cold. Our bodies, our muscles specifically, can generate heat by shivering. And cell adjustments, so antifreeze proteins, certain proteins are only produced when our body temperature drops. So that way our cells our cell membrane having unsaturated lipids and fats within them, and different kinds of enzymes as well, all keep our cells from freezing up or becoming too viscous in a sense, so that way it does not, so we don't turn into a popsicle basically, and our cells can still function. Countercurrent heat exchange is basically our body's plan where we have arteries and veins in our body that are adjacent to one another. So arteries, part of our circulatory system, take blood away into our extremities. Veins bring the blood back. So in this case, as arteries leave, or the blood leaves via the artery, it's going to be warm, and then it cools down, and now it's going to come back kind of chilly. Those two blood supply, blood flow are next to each other, and arteries being warmer, they can give heat to the veins blood, which is a little cooled down from being returned from our extremities. And that's known as the countercurrent heat exchange. This diagram shows our body responses when normal body temperature is increased or decreased. So focusing on the top part of this diagram, normal body temperature in Celsius is around 36 to 38 degrees, which we all know is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. As body temperature increases, there's a trigger in our brain, the hypothalamus, which is going to activate cooling mechanisms. Our blood vessels in our skin are going to dilate, which means to open up, and our body is going to sweat. And that process will help our body temperature to decrease back into a normal body range. Now, when our body temperature decreases, so we're cold, our hypothalamus again is activated, and now we need to be warmed up. So there's a message sent. Our blood vessels in our skin are going to constrict or be smaller, and our muscles are going to shiver to help generate heat. And our body temperature from that increases, and then we're back into the normal body temperature range. So this, again, is a part of the system which includes metabolism and us, again, being endotherms. Conserving energy is really important for organisms should the environment change drastically, whether it be too hot or too cold. Torpor is a physiological state in which activity is low for the organism and metabolic rate or metabolism decreases. So this is going to be a physiological state, again, that is low, such as brain activity, basic metabolism, muscle movement. Everything is slowed down. So it allows the organism to save energy while avoiding difficult and dangerous conditions, like I just said, like extremes in the environment. One which we've all heard of is hibernation. So this is torpor during winter cold, when it's extremely cold, and food is scarce. So it's not beneficial for the organism to go out and face those harsh conditions, risking death when there really isn't that much food as it is. So then the organism will hibernate. The other one, which we haven't really heard too much about, is estivation. So it's just the opposite, even though it's still torpor. It's summer torpor, where the organism is able to survive long periods of high temperatures and not necessarily scarce food, but in this case, scarce water. So again, that's the same thing. It's like hibernating, but in the summertime when there's extreme heat. Although we're not learning in depth about Chapter 32, Section 4, the excretory system, there is a little bit that you should know. One factor is osmoregulation. So osmoregulation is an organism's way to control the solute concentration within the fluid in the body, or the interstitial fluid. This needs to allow a balance between water gains and losses. So that way, obviously, the body is still maintaining homeostasis. So if we look at a few different examples how different organisms do this, you would think that when we're looking at fish that they do osmoregulation the same, but there are differences. Mainly being, where does this fish live? Does it live in seawater? Is it considered a marine fish, or is it a fish that lives in fresh water? So a marine fish, if you look at the diagram on the left, a marine fish living in salt water, it uptakes water and sodium through food and through eating, and also brings in a lot of salt by drinking the seawater or salt water that it's living in. Now, the way that it excretes is through its gills. So it can excrete salt and water through the gills, and then it also loses salt ions and different amounts of water through its urine, so from its kidneys and that excretory system. Now, osmoregulation in freshwater fish is different because its environment isn't salt water. So freshwater fish gain primarily its water, again, from food and from drinking, and it brings in salt and more water through its gills. So that's going to be a little bit different from the marine fish. And the freshwater fish, it can excrete, again, salt and water through its urine via its kidneys and that excretory system. So a little bit different of osmoregulation between two different kinds of fish. And now looking at another waste that our bodies, and not just our bodies, but other organisms need to get rid of, nitrogenous waste. These molecules can be very toxic if they build up in our body. So where do they come from? So different macromolecules that get broken down, whether it's proteins, getting broken down into amino acids, nucleic acids, which are made of those nitrogenous bases. When they get broken down, amino groups are released. And again, these molecules can be very toxic when they build up. So depending on the organism, the amino group can get converted into different types of nitrogenous waste, which must be excreted. So aquatic animals like bony fish released the nitrogenous waste as ammonia. Mammals like us and sharks and other kinds of bony fish and amphibians release the nitrogenous waste as urea through the urine. And then birds, still through the way that they excrete, and often on the windshield of our car, they release their nitrogenous waste as uric acid. So again, there must be a maintenance going on of salt, water, different kinds of ions, sodium, calcium, all to, again, allow for good homeostasis in our muscles, neurons, body cells, etc. And these are different processes which allow for that, again, osmoregulation, controlling that any kind of solute concentration, and water as well. One body system you should be a little bit familiar with, again, in section 4, an organ system that osmoregulates is the excretory system. Now, what exactly do you need to know about this system? You should know that it includes our kidneys and that we have 2 of them. You should also know that the kidneys, again, filter, try to balance our body fluids, again, the ions, and also get rid of waste via our urine in our bladder, and then obviously it's dispelled and excreted. So one other thing that you should know about our kidneys is that the functional unit of our kidney is the nephron. And nephrons are the actual parts that produce the urine in our kidneys. One thing I didn't mention on the previous slide is, where does the urine come from? Like, what exactly is getting filtered? Blood is getting filtered, and thanks to the nephrons, and water concentration is maintained, again, within the human kidney, which is a part of our excretory system, and helps us to maintain homeostasis, and is an example also of osmoregulation. So a lot, again, of different terminology or words within the excretory system you should be just a little bit familiar with, not this whole diagram.